Episode 1. The Arrival. The world was fire and pain. He awoke to the scent of burning, the taste of iron on his tongue. His body ached as if it had been shattered and hastily pieced together. His vision blurred in and out, the world around him swimming in streaks of orange and black. Shadows moved in the distance, dark figures against the glow of fire. He lay on his back, staring up at the sky. It was vast, endless, sprinkled with tiny, distant lights. Something about it felt wrong, or different. He couldn't remember why. The memories were scattered, broken, a fall, a terrible fall, and then nothing. Pain lanced through his limbs as he forced himself upright. The ground beneath him was rough and scorched, littered with smoking debris. Something had come down from the sky. Something violent. But what? His head pounded as he tried to focus. He reached out, fingers brushing against charred remains of something metallic. Not metal, not exactly something smoother, something unfamiliar. Yet, somehow, he knew it intimately. But the details slipped through his mind like sand through fingers. A sound, distant at first, then growing louder. Footsteps, the crunch of dry earth under heavy soles. He turned his head sharply. Figures emerged from the darkness, carrying torches. Their silhouettes flickered in the firelight. They were moving towards him, fast, urgent. Their bodies were encased in strange coverings, bronze glinting in the night, thick leather straps holding weapons at their sides. Their faces were hard, set in grim determination. They were speaking, voices low and urgent, but the words were incomprehensible. He felt something primal stir in his gut. Instinct. A warning. He was being hunted. Adrenaline surged through his veins, overriding the pain. He pushed himself to his feet, staggering backward. The figures shouted, their movements growing sharper, more aggressive. One raised something, an object long and glinting, catching the firelight. A weapon. He recognized it even if he didn't know how. The first one lunged. He reacted without thought. His body knew what to do even if his mind was still catching up. He ducked, twisted, and lashed out. A hand connected with flesh, a sharp, precise strike. The figure crumpled with a strangled gasp. More shouts, more movement. They rushed toward him, and he ran. His legs carried him through the darkness, deeper into the unknown. The land was rough and uneven, patches of dry grass and jagged stone cutting into his feet. But he didn't stop. The voices behind him grew fainter, but they did not disappear. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know where he was. But one thing was certain. He had to keep running. Episode 2. The Fugitive. The night stretched endlessly before him. He ran until his breath came in ragged gasps, his body screaming for rest, but he dared not stop. The firelit figures behind him had faded into the distance, but he knew they were still hunting. The terrain shifted beneath his aching feet, from the scorched earth of the crash site to something softer, damp soil, tangled underbrush. A forest. The towering trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching for him like grasping hands. He plunged into the shadows, pressing himself low, listening. The night carried distant sounds, owls, rustling leaves, the faint murmur of running water. And then, closer now, voices. Still searching. His mind screamed at him to remember. Who was he? What had happened? Why did his body move like a warrior's, reacting before thought? He reached down, fingers brushing against his skin. Torn fabric, dried blood, bruises. But underneath it all, something else. Something unnatural. A pattern, raised and etched into his flesh. Not a tattoo. Not a scar. Something older. Something that pulsed faintly beneath his skin. The voices grew nearer. He had no time for answers. He turned and crept deeper into the trees. For hours he moved in silence, following the sound of running water until he found a small stream. He knelt, cupping water into his trembling hands, drinking greedily. His reflection in the rippling surface startled him. His face, hollowed by exhaustion, smeared with dirt and blood, was unfamiliar. He should have recognized himself, but he didn't. A rustling in the bushes snapped him to attention. He spun, ready to fight or flee, but what emerged was no armored pursuer. It was a girl. She was young, barely past childhood. Her wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. She clutched a woven basket, her bare feet caked with mud. Her gaze flicked to his wounds, then back to his face. She said something in that strange, lilting language. He didn't understand. She hesitated, then slowly knelt, dipping her hands into the water. She cupped some and offered it to him. He stared at her, uncomprehending. Another noise, a distant shout. The girl's head snapped up. Fear flooded her expression. She looked back at him, hesitating only a moment before motioning for him to follow. He hesitated, but he had no choice. With one last glance over his shoulder, he followed her into the dark. Episode 3. The Truth Revealed. The girl led him through the dense underbrush, her movements quick but careful. They moved in silence, only the occasional rustling of leaves or distant animal call breaking the quiet. His mind reeled with questions, but there were no answers yet. They reached a small clearing where a crude hut of woven branches and mud stood against the backdrop of towering trees. She gestured for him to enter. Inside, the space was dimly lit by the glow of embers in a clay bowl. Strange markings adorned the walls, symbols he didn't recognize but felt oddly familiar. The girl produced a small bundle of herbs, grinding them into a paste. She pointed to his wounds and then to the paste. He understood. Cautiously, he allowed her to tend to him. As the night stretched on, fragments of memory began to surface. The fall, the fire, and then stars. A sky different from this one, a place far from here. The realization struck him like a hammer blow. He was not from this world, and the ones hunting him knew it. But how? Did they see him fall? Or did they already know of him before he arrived? His thoughts swirled in confusion and unease. The girl watched him carefully. After a long silence, she pressed her hand to her chest and spoke a name, Livia. He hesitated, then mimicked the motion. No name came to him, only silence. She frowned but did not press him. Instead, she pointed to a crude drawing on the wall. It depicted men with weapons, chasing a lone figure. Him. She had known about them all along, and that meant he was in more danger than he realized. Episode 4. The Hunt Intensifies. Dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson as he sat by the entrance of the hut, watching the first light filter through the dense canopy. Livia slept nearby, curled beneath a rough woolen blanket, her breath steady and peaceful. But he could not rest. His mind was a storm. The realization of what he was not, burned within him. Yet, the questions remained. How had he come to be here? And why did they hunt him so relentlessly? A distant sound shattered his thoughts. The rhythmic stomp of boots against the earth. The hunt had begun anew. Livia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, then at the direction of the sound. Her face grew pale. She knew. Without a word, she motioned for him to follow. They gathered a small satchel of food and supplies before vanishing into the undergrowth. The chase was on. As they fled deeper into the wilderness, the landscape changed. Rolling hills gave way to rocky outcrops, the air growing colder. They found brief shelter in a cave, where Livia drew symbols in the dirt, maps, directions, warnings. Then, a noise outside. Shadows moved at the entrance. They were not alone. Episode 5. The Betrayal. He had trusted them. For days, he had lived among them. Juno, the healer, who tended to his wounds. Marcus, the old soldier with sharp eyes and a wary stance. And Livia, the girl who had first found him by the river. Their village was small, hidden away in the forest, filled with simple people who asked few questions and offered shelter. But it had all been a lie. The hunters had come at dawn. A full cohort of Roman soldiers, ironclad and merciless. And someone had told them exactly where to look. Betrayal burned hotter than the fires set to the village. He ran through the smoke-choked streets, evading soldiers who moved with brutal efficiency. Screams echoed, metal clashed against metal, and the acrid scent of burning thatch filled the air. A shadow lunged at him, Marcus. The old soldier's face was lined with regret, but his grip was firm. You should have kept running. He tore free, shoving Marcus aside. The soldiers closed in. There was no escape. Livia's voice, desperate, "Go!" A spear hurtled through the smoke. He turned just in time to see it coming. And then, darkness. Episode 6, The Final Stand. The village burned, the night sky thick with smoke and the scent of blood. The Romans had come in overwhelming numbers, their disciplined ranks methodically tearing through the last pockets of resistance. Screams of the dying echoed across the valley, a symphony of destruction. He stumbled, gripping his side where the spear had grazed him, blood trickling between his fingers. The pain barely registered. His body had endured far worse. His mind was clearer now, memories piecing together with each heartbeat. He was not of this world. He had fallen from the sky, his vessel shattered upon impact. The symbols on his skin were not markings of this land. They were remnants of something far greater. The Romans feared him because they did not understand him. And what they did not understand, they sought to destroy. Through the haze of battle, he saw her, Livia. She had survived. She stood near the collapsed ruins of her home, her dagger clenched in trembling hands. A Roman soldier advanced on her, sword raised. Time slowed. He moved without thought, crossing the distance between them in a blur. His body reacted before his mind could register the action, an instinct buried deep within him. He struck, his fist slamming into the soldier's chest with inhuman force. The man's body lifted from the ground, crashing against a wooden beam with a sickening crunch. He did not rise. Livia turned to him, her face a mixture of shock and relief. "You." There was no time for words. More soldiers advanced, their bronze armor gleaming in the firelight. The centurion leading them stepped forward, his scarred face set in grim determination. He raised his gladius, pointing it at the stranger who had defied the might of Rome. "Surround him," the centurion barked. The soldiers obeyed, forming a tight circle around him. Spears leveled, swords drawn, their eyes filled with both fear and resolve. They had seen what he could do, but they were Romans. They did not retreat. They conquered. The stranger took a slow breath, feeling the energy beneath his skin, the power that had been dormant since the crash. It pulsed now, awakening. He flexed his fingers, and the air around him seemed to ripple. The Romans hesitated. Then he moved. He was faster than they could comprehend. He weaved between them, his strikes landing with bone-shattering precision. A soldier swung his sword. He caught the blade mid-air, twisting it from the man's grip and driving it into another. He spun, ducked under a spear thrust, and countered with a brutal kick that sent another warrior sprawling. The centurion charged, his gladius flashing in the firelight. The stranger met him head-on. Their blades clashed, sparks flying. The centurion was skilled, his movements precise, but he was human. The stranger was something more. With a final, decisive strike, he disarmed the centurion, sending the sword skidding across the dirt. He grabbed the man by the throat, lifting him effortlessly. Their eyes met, and for the first time, the Roman's resolve faltered. "What are you?" The centurion gasped. The stranger didn't answer. He released the man, letting him collapse to the ground, gasping for breath. The remaining soldiers hesitated. Their leader defeated, their formation broken, they faltered. The stranger stood amidst them, breathing heavily, his body glowing faintly with an energy not of this world. Then, in the distance, a sound. A deep, resonant hum. He turned his gaze skyward. Through the smoke and ash, the heavens split open. A great vessel, unlike anything the Romans had ever seen, descended from the stars. Its metallic hull gleamed in the moonlight, runes similar to those on his skin pulsing with ethereal light. It had come for him. The Romans stood frozen in awe and terror. Livia stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "You're leaving, aren't you?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had fought for them, bled for them. He had found something in this world, something worth protecting. But he did not belong here. A ramp extended from the vessel, the light beckoning him. He took one step forward, then another. But he hesitated. Livia reached for him, but she knew she could not stop him. Instead, she spoke the words he would never forget. "Remember us." He nodded. And then, With one last glance at the burning village, he stepped into the light. The vessel ascended, vanishing into the night sky, leaving only silence behind. The Romans, their world forever changed, watched in stunned silence. The centurion, still on his knees, whispered the only word that came to mind: gods. But Livia knew better. He was no god. He was something else entirely, something the world would never see again.